Poetry by Melissa Phillips, Summer 2013, ED 5689. To quote Robert Frost, "We love the things we love for what they are." This workshop is all about informing you on poetry. An overview of poetry. Poetry is a literary work in which special intensity is given to the expression of feelings and ideas by the use of distinctive style and rhythm. It may use condensed or compressed form to convey emotion or ideas to the reader's or listener's mind or ear. When teaching students to write poetry, it is necessary that teachers show students how to develop meaningful content and poetic language as they write poetry. Students are most successful when teachers write in front of them and model the step-by-step process of poetry writing. Students will gain so much by seeing their teacher model and seeing that their teacher has a passion for writing poetry. That's when students will be successful, when they see their teacher passionate about something and the teacher is also modeling the step-by-step process. A benefit for children associated with reading poetry could be enjoyment, exposure to vocabulary, increased attention to language and wordplay, and the development of insights about ourselves, others, and the world in which we live. Poetry also helps children look at ordinary things in new ways. Using literary models, teachers can invite and support students in composing first-person poetry about specific people, places, and perspectives. In the process, students can deepen their understanding of characters, setting, plot, conflict, and narrative point of view. Shortly, we will be going over how teachers can invite and support students in composing first-person poetry. Poetry format. Poetry depends less on the language components of sentences and paragraphs and more on components that are purely poetic. The normal elements are the line, the stanza, and verse paragraph. We have some discussion questions now. So let's pause in a minute to discuss what kind of forms, types of poetry that you as a teacher have used, written, and that you know from already teaching them. Also, has anyone implemented poetry into a content area? Has anyone ever heard of an I poem or used this type in their classroom? As part of this workshop, let's pause for 5 minutes to have a discussion. Great discussion. Let's move on. Now, when teaching poetry, it's great to show some examples. The reading text by Ralph Fletcher, Poetry Matters, is a book to help students write poems and to give children ideas for making their poems sound the way they want them to sound. This book is about writing poetry, not questioning it. This book will help students to have more pleasing moments writing poetry. Poetry Matters by Ralph Fletcher will be an encouraging, fun book to share to your students to make them be passionate for writing poetry. There are several types of poetry. For this workshop, we will be talking about 4. The acrostic poem, 5 W's poem, sensory poem, and the I poem. Let's look at some examples on the next couple of slides of different types of poetry. The acrostic poem. An acrostic poem is one in which certain letters, often the first letter of every line, form a name or a theme. When you are teaching the acrostic poem, it's important to explain to your students about the format. How when we write an acrostic poem, we line up the first letter going down on the left side of the paper. The example is with the word grape. We spell grape going down. G, grapes are yummy. R, red and sweet. A, always wash before you eat. P, picking grapes are fun. E, eat them day and night. Grape. It's activity time. This time you would use to allow your class to write their own acrostic poem for practice and for learning. It's great to use a content area and pick a topic of something that possibly that you're teaching the students or that your students have learned in class. For example, for science, if you're working on a ladybug unit, have them write an acrostic poem using the word ladybug. Social studies, use the word colonies. Math, use the word addition. Let's pause for 5 minutes for activity time. Okay, great. Great time during activity time. The next type of poetry that I'd like to talk about is the 5 W's poetry. Each line in this type of poem answers one of the 5 W's. The 5 W's are who, what, when, where, and why. We have some examples of the 5 W's poetry, which we'll go to the website and look at. So you could take a minute to pause, show your students the website, and come right back. Here's an example. The who, I, what, in the love eating strawberries. When, in the afternoon. Where, in my kitchen. Why, 'cause they're so good for me. That's an example of a 5 W's poem. Another type of poetry is the sensory poem. We use these senses, the sight, sound, smell, and taste. I was standing in the garden when I saw a lovely tree. Sight. I heard a strawberry fall. Sound. It smelled so very sweet. Smell. I took a bite. Yum. Taste. An example of a sensory poem. The next type of poem is the I poem. The narrator of an I poem can be a person, place, or object that speaks directly to readers. Let's pause 2 minutes, share the website with the class to review examples of an I poem. Okay, great. Now that we saw an example on the website, here's an example I would like to share for this workshop. For the I poem. I am polite and kind. I wonder about my daughter's future. I hear a dog's cry. I see the ocean. I want to do it all over again. I am polite and kind. As we saw on the website for our example, for the I poem, There is a format that we can use, starting with I am, I wonder, I hear, I see, I want, I am. Activity time. Now that the class has learned about another type of poetry, let's allow the class to think about writing their own I poem. They can sure use one of the formats that we just learned on the website. Pause for 5 minutes for activity time. Okay, great. Great job writing I poems. A conclusion about our poetry workshop. When writing informational acrostic poetry as a response to reading and content areas, it provides a creative format for students to integrate the knowledge they have learned. Developing acrostic poems in the content area learned will help a student form a poem. This goes back to when we talked about for social studies. If you're doing a unit on Indians or colonies, let the students have the keyword be Indians. Line the letters up on the left side, and then as their topic, Indians, let the students elaborate on Indians and what they've learned about Indians to use as their topic. This is a great way to have students writing in a genre and not just for a response question. So writing poems in the content area is great because then the students are writing for a genre, not just to write an answer. Inviting and supporting students in writing I poems is one way to help students to begin noticing who characters are, why they feel and act as they do, and how they see things. As we went over with the I poem, we talk about I am, I wonder, I hear, I see, I want, and then we end again with I am. With the I poem, you can begin noticing what places are like and what makes one place different from another, and to begin noticing the impact of the carefully chosen and placed word. Sharing poetry with young children and examining different types of poetry is a great way to encourage all children to write a poem of their preference. It's teaching different types of poetry in early childhood classrooms is great exposure for students to learn about poetry. Allowing a student to learn different types of poems will give the student a great opportunity to write a poem of their preference. If students like acrostic poems and they have the knowledge and they know about what to do to write them, point them in that direction. If a student would rather write an I poem and describe I am, I wonder, I hear, guide them in that direction. Teaching different types of poetry early on can make a writer so passionate of wanting to write poetry. There are several different types of poetry out there, and exposing the students, children, early on will give them great exposure for learning how to write poetry. To quote Jack Perlesky, "A poet is not something you become, a poet is something you are." Everyone can write poetry, be passionate about it, and put their mind to it. Thank you for listening and becoming part of this poetry workshop.